Welcome. It's my pleasure to be part of this training session for training all of you trainers on the roles of teachers and trainers in this new process. The manual that you have and that you have received has been designed to create relevant training education to build the necessary bridges for better communication and understanding for the Roma population. Not only for that, but also related to the Roma employment issue, in order to decrease the sense of disenfranchisement and increase the sense of belonging, being part of a group and a member of the society. This program seeks to provide an open and receptive environment by reducing the sense of vulnerability and non-inclusiveness. It tries to, first of all, create open communication, specifically as to how to better serve the Roma population for a fuller, more inclusive environment, and to increase the kind of employment opportunities available, as well as educate both parties on the rights and inclusion strategies to gain further acceptance for all. The scope is to ensure social inclusion and equality by reducing and overcoming obstacles in order to achieve this success. This particular manual that has been created offers trainers the practical applications and work-throughs that reinforce the concepts of acceptance, recognizing and appreciating one's strengths and weaknesses, as well as cultural sensitivity in fostering better communication and trust. The basic process of this training incorporates creating lists for every participant and examining how each is affected by the situations, and exploring challenges and opportunities for each activity and exercise, and appreciating differences of others and their cultures, as well as sensitizing on acceptance and educating others to the challenges. Specifically, the scope of this training is to get one step closer to the final objective of further developing an area where equality and the rights of persons, as enshrined in the treaty, the charter, and the International Human Rights Conventions, are promoted and protected. Some of the questions before we begin that we have to look towards in order to build these necessary bridges for better communication and understanding is, how do we sensitize the need for recognizing and valuing the differences in others? And many of the definitions that we're looking towards, I think, are really important. Differences in all aspects, including social and cultural ones, should not be a barrier to the full enjoyment of human rights. On the contrary, they should be embraced as a force of change and advancement in societies at the local and global level. The focus is a need to sensitize the recognizing and valuing the differences in others. In order to achieve this, we need to identify how much we know as opposed to how much we take for granted, or never really thought about our behavior, to look at how we behave and to identify and sensitize the learners to some of the areas which they need to become more aware and sensitive to. As part of the checklist, with regard to nonverbal communication, for instance, should I expect differences in what is thought of as appropriate personal space? Should I avoid any particular gestures? Should I expect differences in the level of acceptable eye contact? As opposed to the area of communication, do I know when to use first names and surnames? Should I anticipate different attitudes about the acceptability of asking personal questions, or towards acceptability of humor and emotions, or about the expression of anger or towards the display of affection? Some of the questions we need to think about during all of these exercises is, how do we adapt or change? Why is it necessary to educate? How do we see ourselves and how are we seen? And how do we work to develop the trust? How can we come together where all diversity is respected? Again, by definition, trust is an integral part in the fight against discrimination as regards education and employment. Without having trust that differences are not important in assessing one's value, we cannot overcome social barriers. Trust refers to both the mistrust of Roma people, which stems from the perpetrated and systemic discriminatory behavior towards them, and to the mistrust of people that act as employers, educational professionals, counsels towards the Roma people. Understanding diversity is essential in creating a training environment sensitive to discrimination issues. Although basic, the notion that differences are to be respected is difficult to apply in practice and transmit the relevant message at the trainer's level. So let's begin. On our first slide, as you can see, building the necessary bridges for better communication and understanding. The central goal is to, as I said earlier, to decrease the sense of disenfranchisement of Roma within the community and to increase the sense of belonging, to be part of a group and to be a member of society. Now, how do we do this? How do we achieve this? It's important in order to get this to happen is to create open communication with the scope of ensuring social inclusion and equality, as well as educating both parties on the rights and inclusion strategies to gain further acceptance for all. The only way we can do this is by providing the right settings. One of the major things that's underscored here is the hope, and that hope is to provide a more inclusive environment. And the only way to provide that is to educate to the kind of employment opportunities that can be available and are available, and by providing the strategies to both parties. And in order to get that hope, the aim is that human rights and inclusion to gain further acceptance for all, to identify, reduce, and overcome the obstacles in order to achieve success. Specifically, the process or the methodology, what we'd like to do is to introduce you to the first lesson, which basically is entitled, How Do We Identify the Situation? And by identifying the situation, we create lists for each of the participants. Specifically, we ask the question, how is each affected by the Roma situation? We identify and clarify each of the challenges that result from the identified list created. And in so doing, we explore the challenges and possible opportunities for each challenge that has been identified. As exploring these responses to the list, the takeaways that we seek to find are recognizing the impact of appreciating differences of others and their cultures. In this recognition, we then can lead to a sensitization which leads to acceptance, summarizing the impact of these challenges on each group. The second lesson, which is part of the warm-ups, is the handout that you will have been receiving or you have in your packet, which is called the Culture Checklist. In that checklist, we seek to find how much do we recognize in ourselves and ourselves in others. In so doing, we create a dialogue of comparing and contrasting each of the topics from the questionnaire. We also look at nonverbal communication and communication. How do we react to differences in these communicative reactions? Are we suspect? Is there a sense of distrust? Or is there even some confusion? In many cases, all three of those really do exist. How do we overcome those elements in order to develop trust? How do we communicate our impressions? How do we clarify what is seen? What do we believe is the message, as opposed to what is the actual message? The communication signal checklist, which is the result of the last exercise, allows us to review the statements in the communication signal checklist and set up a chart as the group reviews each statement. What we ask is, do you agree or do you disagree based upon your own standards? Why do you think you responded in that particular fashion? Using the chart, as you can see, and the previous discussion as a basis, we try to enlist the kinds of discussion that will let us understand that whether we believe the reactions reflect those of your country and culture. Do you believe that these reactions reflect the opposite of the way your country and culture functions? By using these previous work-throughs, we then can encourage a dialogue and discussion which focuses on misunderstandings that could occur when using your ways of communication with people who are from a different country or culture. The interactive teaching tool and the manual assists you, and this is basically the way in which trainers can provide practical applications through the work-throughs. Work-throughs, as you know, are those practical exercises and scenarios that foster discussion and insights as to how to achieve, as I said earlier, acceptance, recognizing and appreciating one's strengths and weaknesses, and cultural sensitivity in fostering better communication and trust. I know this may sound somewhat repetitive, but it is critical that we all understand that in order for the process to succeed and these exercises to be of maximum importance, we reinforce these concepts within this larger context. In order to achieve this, the process requires creating the list for each participant to examine how they are affected by a situation. Again, let's refer back to Lesson 1 as the example. How their workshop partners are affected within the same situation, and explore the challenges and opportunities that result from the exercise. It's our hope that the end result will be one in which the experience can help foster a new appreciation of the differences of others and their cultures. It's also one in which we seek to increase sensitization and acceptance of those differences, and to extend these realizations to be a better educated so that we can deal with these existing and new challenges within the context of hopefully sensitizing those experiences we have just learned. This new awareness promotes a more collaborative, open, and trusting environment to share feelings, observations, and eventually those potential sources of concern. The next segment looks at how do we try to create and provide that open and receptive environment. The program reveals the two essential conditions that are necessary for inclusion: education participation, and the second topic is one in which we employ employment opportunities. Those are our two major topics in which we focus on in order to gain that sensitivity and understanding. In order to set the stage for this, I'd like to introduce you to a story that was written by a man called Roosevelt Thomas Ir. It's a kind of a fable that's entitled The Elephant and the Giraffe. It's a modern fable that opens the discussion for the need to recognize and value the difference in others. One day the giraffe, working in his state-of-the-art woodshop in the basement, happened to look out of the window. Coming down the street was an elephant. I know him, he thought. We work together on a PTA committee. He's an excellent woodworker, too. I think I'll ask him in to see my new shop. Maybe we can even work on some projects. So the giraffe poked his head out of the window and invited the elephant in. The elephant was delighted. He had liked working with the giraffe and looked forward to knowing him better. Besides, he knew about the woodshop and wanted to see it. So he walked up to the basement door and waited for it to open. Come in, the giraffe said, but immediately they encountered a problem. While the elephant could get his head in the door, he could go no further. It's a good thing we made this door expandable to accommodate my woodshop equipment, the giraffe said. Give me a minute while I take care of our problem. He removed some bolts and panels to let the elephant in. The two acquaintances were happily exchanging woodworking stories when the giraffe's wife leaned her head down the basement stairs and called her husband. Telephone, dear, it's your boss. I'd better take that upstairs in the den, the giraffe told the elephant. Please make yourself at home. This may take a while. The elephant looked around, saw a half-finished piece of work on the lathe table in the far corner, and decided to explore it further. As he moved through the doorway that led to the shop, he heard an ominous scrunch. He backed out, scratching his head. Maybe I'll join the giraffe upstairs, he thought. As he sat there disheveled and dismayed, the giraffe came down the stairs. What on earth is happening here? The giraffe asked in amazement. I was trying to make myself at home, the elephant said. The giraffe looked around. Okay, I see the problem. The doorway is too narrow. We'll have to make you smaller. There's an aerobic studio near here. If you take some classes there, we could get you down to size. Maybe, the elephant said, not looking very convinced.
Again, maybe.
Maybe, the elephant said, not looking very convinced. And the stairs are too weak to carry your weight, the giraffe continued. If you took a ballet class at night, I'm sure we could get you light on your feet. I really hope you'll do it. I like having you here. Perhaps, the elephant said, but to tell you the truth, I'm not sure a house designed for a giraffe will ever really work for an elephant, not unless there are some major changes. How can we come together where all diversity is respected, finds its space, and is actively used and appreciated? What are your feelings about this fable? How does it apply to our everyday interactions in our community everywhere? What activities have to be put in action in order to have all parties feel a sense of ownership and equalities? In the words of the fable, the community needs to examine its house in terms of its accommodations, its strengths, and its weaknesses. The community has to respect and acknowledge them, and the community will face obstacles which will inevitably be accompanied by tensions, which should be confronted, as we said earlier, accepted, as we said earlier, and hopefully resolved in a positive way. The moral of the fable is that in order to make everyone feel a part of a community, the giraffe, the community has to respect and acknowledge everyone, the elephant, and that we must accept the fact that any process will face obstacles in order to achieve growth and eventual success. Obstacles can and usually lead to tension, and tension is sometimes necessary as well as sometimes good, because the tension needs to be confronted, accepted, and resolved in a positive way in order to achieve success. Part of the questions that we seek to pose as part of the work through with this exercise deals with what are your feelings about the fable? How do you think it applies to our everyday interactions in our community? What activities can be put into action to have all the parties feel a sense of belonging? And how do we identify how much we really know? Again, the whole point of the fable is to act as a jumping off point. It's to act as a way in which we can put into context not only the fable, but how that applies in real life and how we identify with our own personal situation. This lesson seeks to help the group focus on how much we really know, as opposed to how much we never really thought about our behavior and how it affects our decisions and how we act. If we look upon the culture checklist, this exercise helps to identify the similarities and differences in cultures. Again, we recommend that we start up with the warm-up, and the handout that we have is the culture checklist. By so doing, we create a dialogue of comparing and contrasting each of the topics from the questionnaire. With regard to nonverbal communication, one of the critical areas and topics that fall into those places has to do with the areas of personal space, gestures, eye contact, body language. How are these particular nonverbal communications similar or different from our own? And how do they affect our communication? In some cultures, we speak very close to each other. Others, we need to have less personal space. Other cultures require more personal space. Eye contact is critical in many cultures. In others, it is considered to be non-deferential if we are looking at somebody. The same thing with our body language. Communication is the second component of this. Asking personal questions, the degree of humor that we use in terms of talking to people, how we affect ourselves with our voices. Do we tend to be very emotional? Do we tend to be very soft-spoken? Is there a tendency in our approach to interrupt when other people are speaking? Or does other cultures tend to be much more deferential? Do we express our anger? Most cultures do not express anger. They tend to be very soft-spoken. How does that differ? What do those signals dictate to us? The concept of small talk. Many of us understand that we come from cultures which require that kind of chattiness, where other cultures just are not accustomed to that. Even down to the way we basically use our surnames. Many people in certain cultures refer to each other by first name basis. In other cultures, that's considered to be impolite. The tone and the pitch of our very quality of our voice. Many people speak in a soft, muted tone, while others have a high-pitched, loud way of speaking. And the most interesting is the displays of affection. Many cultures are very affectionate. They hug, they shake hands in a very, very close fashion. Others do not respond in that same fashion. There's a stronger sense of distancing. There's a stronger sense of formality. As a result of the warm-up exercise, one of the questions again that comes up again and again in this particular program is, how is what we see in ourselves the same or different from what we think others see? Why does it happen, and how should we adapt or change? And why is it important and crucial to educate others? Again, looking at our culture checklist, how do we react to differences in these communicative reactions? How do we communicate our impressions in order to develop that concept of trust? And how do we clarify what is seen by asking, what do we believe is the message, as opposed to what is the actual message? Those two sentences are incredibly critical. Much of what we think we hear is not exactly what we are basically being told. It's important that we get to know you, and it's even more important that you get to know me. In order to establish better communication and trust, we need to explore our perceptions and values and how they are colored by our backgrounds. How does getting to know each other help in improving our social relationships, our careers, etc.? One of the first activities, and there are a number of activities in this program, is a kind of a fun and interesting way of getting to know each other. It's preparing for your partner a briefing of your country. What you need to do is to include a complete picture of the geography, the history, the business, politics, and language, the current political situation, the legal system, the religious influences, ethnic minorities, gender, education, etc. And even more important, as we said earlier, communication styles, the kinds of gestures that are used, the levels of formality, the taboos in that culture. And sometimes even more fun than that is the kinds of shopping and entertaining, food and housing, approaches to work, and the way in which we meet both formally and informally. The second part of the activity is how many of these areas color the way we see ourselves and the way others see me. The discussion with the group, using your own personal experiences as a jumping off point on these larger issues, is how could we reverse these impressions through communication? How can we better educate our community once we understand what these impressions are to these obstacles? And most importantly, as a group, which we hope to come about with, is how do we formulate a plan or a strategy together in order to make this happen successfully? As I said, the second portion of this program deals with careers and emerging opportunities. It's important that we consider and understand the changing role of education and the need for new and emergent skill sets in the 21st century. How can the new and varying technologies help in your communication? And even more importantly, the role of technology in providing new careers and opportunities for all on a now level playing field. The emerging workforce in the IT sector is critical. It is more important than ever before, and it is one that really requires the input of everyone and doesn't really have the old patterns of behavior, but basically encourages new and creative ways of thinking as this particular field keeps growing. We need to create a list of careers in the field. And as a part of that list, we need to then look at what your strengths are, as well as what are your weaknesses. And from that, what we know, we can see how we can grow. Again, I think two of the critical areas that we need to always keep in mind in this particular domain is that this is much less about speech and much more about written communication, and that these various new and emerging technologies can help in our communication. Thank you for participating in this training. We look forward to offering you any support in the future and to the success of the program. Thank you again.